The Chronicles of Myrtana Archolos is a total conversion mod for Gothic 2 that serves as a prequel of sorts to the Gothic trilogy, telling the story of a group of refugees fleeing the impending Orc War and trying to start up a new life on the remote island of Archolos. You play as a cheat code named Marvin who arrives on Archolos with his brother Yorn seeking out their uncle before Yorn gets injured and eventually kidnapped, thus triggering the main quest to presumably find Yorn and get him back to safety. As a total conversion mod, it has its own completely original map and storyline and basically functions like its own standalone entry in the Gothic series, offering a brand new full game experience with up to 100 hours or more of content. As a fan-made project, the amount of work that's gone into it is impressive, and for the most part, it gives off the feeling of being a professional product that could have been sold as an official Gothic game back in the day. I've been playing through it lately, and I can already tell it's going to take me forever to actually finish it, and with the upcoming release of Elix 2, I'm unlikely to finish playing and reviewing Archolos anytime soon, so I figured I'd take a moment to share some of my preliminary thoughts and impressions after finishing the first chapter thus far. For the sake of simplicity, I'll be sorting this into bullet points based on things I like, things I dislike, and things I'm uncertain of. Bear in mind that these are all early game impressions. I haven't had time to try out every new gameplay mechanic or explore everywhere on the island or do thorough testing of everything, and I've seen maybe 15% or less of what the game has to offer. As such, these impressions may not be accurate for the whole game, and it's not meant to be a proper review, so take everything I say here with a grain of salt. I am intending to do a full review once I've finished playing it, so depending on when you're watching this, you may want to just skip ahead to the full review, considering some of what I say here may be repeated or outright contradicted by the full review. Also, because the game is still pretty new and I'm still very early in the process of playing it, I'd ask that you please not spoil anything that I've yet to experience beyond Chapter 1, whether that be main story events, or mid to late game mechanics, or quest outcomes, or anything that might impact my future enjoyment. If you do want to discuss those things in the comments, then please give adequate spoiler warnings so that myself and others know when to stop reading or what to avoid reading. Number 1. The Gothic feel is strong. The single most important bit of praise I can give for Archolos is that it genuinely feels like Gothic. Admittedly, a large portion of that is the simple fact that it's built on the classic Gothic engine, using all the familiar Gothic mechanics and with a bunch of familiar Gothic visual assets and even lots of the same Gothic music. So superficially, it's about as close to Gothic as you can possibly get, but the similarities go deeper than that, with plenty of other mechanical aspects like the world design, quest design, characters, dialogue, and so on having a distinctly Gothic vibe to them. I said it already, but it definitely gives the impression that this could have been an official Gothic game back in the day, being as good or better than some of the stuff Piranha Bytes themselves created with Gothic 1 and 2. Speaking as a Gothic veteran and longtime fan of Piranha Bytes, I feel right at home playing Archolos, and it sparks nostalgic feelings of playing the original Gothic games for the first time all over again, unlike any other game I've played since then, including any of Piranha Bytes' later games. Number 2. Feels more like what Gothic 3 should have been. It's no secret that I harbor no love for Gothic 3. I find that game to be thoroughly mediocre as an open-world RPG in general, and especially disappointing as a Gothic game. As an artist, I understand Piranha Bytes' desire to do something different with Gothic 3 because it gets boring creating essentially the same thing over and over again, but that's a case where you make a brand new game altogether, because when you change the core gameplay so much, it stops feeling like the series it's allegedly part of. After all, if a sequel's too different, people will complain that it's not the same game anymore, but if it's too similar, then people will complain that it's just the same thing again. There's a sweet spot between sticking to the familiar formula that people know and like, and doing things that are fresh and exciting, and I feel like Archolos strikes that balance a lot better than Gothic 3, which didn't come close at all. So to me, Archolos feels like what Gothic 3 should have been from the start, which is to say, a direct continuation of the core mechanics and gameplay principles of the first two games that simply expands on the breadth and depth of the experience by merely adding on to existing mechanics with new twists and variations. A large part of my enjoyment playing Archolos isn't just that it feels like the same game I know and love, but that it's also new and different at the same time. It's similar enough that I can feel at home playing it, but with enough brand new features and mechanics that I still get excited by seeing things that are new and different. Number 3. Plenty of nice quality of life improvements. For as good as the original Gothic games are, there was still some crudity in their design that went overlooked by Piranha Bytes, with Gothic 1 being their first game and Gothic 2 being a relatively rushed sequel. Thankfully, Archolos takes some measures to improve the general playability of the core Gothic experience. For the most part, the changes are minor, but they do go a long way to improve the overall functionality of the game without drastically altering anything. For example, I love having the option to blend the tab-based inventory of Gothic 1, which sorts items by category, and the grid-based inventory of Gothic 2, which lets you see more items on screen at one time. Other things like having a dedicated torch button to brandish and stow a torch back into your inventory are unexpectedly welcome solutions to problems that weren't necessarily problems in the original games, but are improved more pleasantly in Archolos. I also like that bows and crossbows are now non-lethal against human opponents, and that you can now choose to cook all your meat at once instead of having to cook everything one at a time. And it's nice having some more options for fast travel early in the game while still keeping them limited. Perhaps more importantly, the developers decided to separate permanent stat boosts from scaling training costs, thereby eliminating the somewhat tedious metagaming from Night of the Raven, where you had to save your permanent stat boost until later in the game, or unequip rings and belts before training, and other annoying workarounds and exploits to mitigate the scaling stat costs. Number 4. Great implementation of tutorials. Gothic 1 and 2 were never partial to having overt tutorials explaining game mechanics to you. Although they usually had helpful NPCs who would teach you lessons about the world and how you should be playing within it, some of their specific mechanics were somewhat obscure and difficult to figure out in the actual game. That's one area in which those games weren't exactly welcoming to new players, because you were expected to figure out a lot of things for yourself or else consult forums and guides online to learn how certain things actually worked. Archolos still uses the old Gothic style of characters explaining things to you, and the entire prologue sequence on the ship serves as a mini tutorial for some of the new mechanics, but for the stuff that's harder to convey immersively, they put that information in optional books that you can seek out and read at your own discretion. I like how they did this, because I can concede that having that kind of information in-game is a good thing, but they're written in such a way that it's not so blatantly calling attention to the fact that they're describing game mechanics to you, and it also ties this information to the environment in a sensibly contextual manner. So even when the game is breaking the fourth wall to explain things to you, it's in a completely non-intrusive and non-disruptive sort of way, which I think is an effective middle ground. Number 5. Seamlessly adding depth on top of existing mechanics. Archolos introduces a lot of new mechanics to the game, like cooking recipes, fletching arrows, and scroll writing, in addition to some other things like fishing and harvesting wood. Despite being all new features, these things feel like sensible evolutions of existing gameplay mechanics that simply add extra depth and variety to the familiar gameplay formula. Fishing and harvesting wood, for instance, is basically the same thing as mining ore, except with different animations and yielding different crafting materials as a result, while cooking, fletching, and scroll writing are basically new forms of crafting, all of which are built into the existing dialogue interface for selecting options. This, I feel, is an elegant way to expand on the gameplay while still keeping everything feeling rooted to the core gameplay formula. Nothing feels out of place, and it's all pretty easy to learn and figure out. Number 6. Lots of dialogue choices with branching paths. Archolos gives you some good options for what you say in dialogue, which will lead to branching outcomes, like whether Timo will live or die, how Ezekiel handles the death of his daughter, whether you go with Yorn to the village or with Fabio to the cave, whether you get the firewood or someone else does, and so on. Other times, this doesn't seem to have any direct mechanical outcome on the situation, but it does provide some extra flavor to make the world seem more reactive to your presence and to give you a more feeling of control over the main character. These are all good aspects for an RPG, though it remains to be seen how much of these choices will impact later stages of the game, or whether the game just front-loaded this type of content to make it seem deeper and more complex up front, but I like what I see so far. Number 7. Combination of random and scripted events. A new change with Archolos is the inclusion of random events, which seem to involve different types of NPCs appearing in different locations to offer random one-off encounters. Every one of these that I've encountered seems to have been incredibly short and simple, like a guy offering some free meat after one of his sheep is killed by a wolf, or another guy asking for help throwing away weeds that he'd picked from the fields, but these add a little extra random excitement to the game because you can never be exactly sure what you'll encounter, when or where, especially because they can occur seemingly at any time, even in areas you've apparently completed or days after first arriving in town. Likewise, the game is sure to include lots of dynamic events as the world changes from your interaction with various quests, like with Ezekiel going to his daughter's grave to pray for her after you secure her burial site, or Rick vomiting the next day after drinking with him, or Albin leaving a notice for everyone to treat you and the other refugees well once you get everyone contributing around town. All of these events, from the random ones to the more scripted ones, help to make the world feel more alive and reactive with dynamic changes as the game goes on. Number 8. Strong world building and characterization. Right off the bat, Archolos does a good job of pulling you into the world with a simple presentation of its starting characters and environments. The intro sequence on the boat gives you some decent opportunities to get to know some of your fellow refugees before arriving on the island, and then those character traits get strengthened once you've actually landed and find yourself in a somewhat treacherous survival situation. There's the bully Fabio, who gives a strong impression on the boat, and then he starts taking charge once on land, but then there's the helplessness of some of the women, the stuck-up snotty ladies, the cowardly Rupert, the solemn Ezekiel, and so on, who present strong personality traits that are conveyed through good writing and voice acting, in addition to gameplay scenarios that work to involve them in the story, like needing to convince Ezekiel to leave his daughter's corpse, or the stuff going on in the cave with everyone else. I felt actual camaraderie with some of these characters, which is impressive considering how early it was in the game. Once you arrive in town properly, conversations with Martha, Victor, and Bastian already give a good sense of this village being its own functioning society and not just a cliché video game town where these characters are there purely to service a chosen hero and dole out quests. Everyone else in town, meanwhile, has their own role to serve within the community, and you get some strong hints of the greater world building going on with the city guard, merchant guilds, water mages, and so on. This kind of stuff is enough to make the opening segments of the game compelling all on their own, even without the Gothic nostalgia. Number 9. Good density of content in Silbach. Silbach is the first major location you arrive at on Archolos, and it's but a modest farming village with only a dozen or two important NPCs, but there's a surprising amount of things going on in Silbach, with interesting conversations, random events, side quests, notice boards to read, little alcoves to explore, and so on top of all the main quest events. While simply trying to advance the main quest to find healing supplies for Yorn, I ran into Rupert, which triggered a new quest to round up supplies to go look for Myvan and Daryl back at the cave. Then I had to talk to people to find out where to find Kurt, who then sent me to Lokvar, who sent me to Riordian, who then goes on a short hunting expedition with me to a shrine, then I'm going fishing with Kurt, then learning scroll writing with Riordian, and so on. I was basically just trying to do one simple thing and wound up involved with a complex web of quests with multiple stages and multiple characters, with new things popping up as I advanced through quest stages and as I completed entire quests. Just finishing everything in and around Silbach took me several sessions across multiple days, so that was interesting because there was constantly something engaging going on, but it never got to feel too overwhelming either. Number 10. Classic unguided quest objectives. As you'd expect for a Gothic game, Archolos uses an unguided system for questing that doesn't rely on quest markers or obnoxiously direct solutions to hold your hand through every step of every quest. In true Gothic fashion, NPCs give you in-world directions like leave town through the east gate and follow the road till you get to a clearing, then go straight, or else give you a general suggestion and it's up to you to figure out where to go or what to do. That's so refreshing to me in this day and age, and I just find it so much more satisfying having to use my own eyes and reasoning to come to solutions on my own, connecting the dots and deducing how the spoken directions translate to the actual world design. I especially like how the quest design handles the main objective to figure out what happened to Yorn when he disappears, because they basically just tell you, talk to people around town and find Yorn. And different people will tell you different things. Some are completely useless, some suggestions are dead ends and red herrings, some people only give you a small piece of the puzzle, and so ultimately you just have to think to yourself, who might know something and which of these leads is the most likely possibility. Even when you eventually come to the correct solution, that he was taken to the city by a pair of strangers, it's still presented in the quest journal as but a suggestion. The game never explicitly tells you, Yorn was taken to the city, go there and find Yorn. There's another moment when you're trying to fetch wood from some people outside of town, and one guy won't cooperate unless you bring him a ghost light, but he never tells you what that is, and it's up to you to talk to other people in the area to figure out what a ghost light might be and where you might go about finding one. So that's all good stuff that makes the quest design and world exploration feel so much more organic and engaging. Number 11. The map is an ideal blend of direction, focus, and openness. I've always liked how the Gothic games presented a focused take on open world design by always allowing you open-ended freedom to go off exploring in whatever direction you like, even at the expense of the main quest, but while creating detailed structures in the environment like winding pathways and cliffs and choke points and specific enemy placements that feel like actual level design with obstacles to traverse while signifying more defined spaces and not just generically bland spaces to spread out the areas of meaningful content just to force you to walk a certain amount of time or distance to your next location. Archolos does a wonderful job of capturing that original Gothic spirit in its map design, with the starting point of Silbach branching out in 4 directions and each area providing a manageable space to explore with interesting structure and lots of complexity tucked away in the folds of the game space. I haven't explored very far outside of Silbach yet, but it's been extremely compelling so far and scratches the fundamental Gothic itch that I always have for exploration in these types of games, but rarely ever get outside of actual Piranha Bytes games. Number 12. Lots of verticality in the world design. Another distinguishing feature of classic Gothic world design is that they managed to incorporate a lot of verticality in the exploration, which you don't really see a lot in other similar games, especially of that era, and so I'm pleased to see Archolos taking similar inspiration by having lots of vertical spaces to climb and traverse. Some of these areas are more prominently intended to be explored with actual paths and meaningful landmarks, like bridges over the waterfalls that lead up to the signal tower, but there are other discrete areas that can lead to rewarding discoveries if you think to climb up a random ledge and just see what's over there. I remember seeing an exterior patio behind a manor and intending to climb up there from behind, but then randomly spotted some other ledges along a cliff face, and next thing you know I've made it up to the top of a mountain. That adds literal depth to the world and helps to make the world design feel more complex, because there are so many areas that you can't see as they're blocked by tall obstacles and require more effort on your part to climb over or get around them in order to see what's out there. So that's yet another area in which Archolos feels true to the Gothic form and which I absolutely love. Number 13. Rewarding exploration everywhere you look. I'm also pleased to say that the designers of Archolos took the extra step to place little rewards in just about every innocuous hidden place you might think to check, whether that be behind a random stack of crates or over a small ledge or finding an entire cave around a corner. Even if it's just a couple basic plants, it's still a nice little sign that the developers were thinking about how people might explore the world and put something there to reward your efforts, to let you know that they were thinking about you. That's always been a big part of what made exploration in the Gothic games, specifically Gothic 2, so enjoyable to me, so I really appreciate Archolos going that route as well. There was one time when I saw what might be a tiny little ledge obscured by some shrubs or vegetation, and I thought, that's exactly where I'd hide some kind of little reward, but that's such a tiny obscure area that there's probably nothing there. There's probably not even a climbable ledge there, and was surprised to actually find a couple of spell scrolls hidden just out of sight. There are a few areas where they didn't put things I would have expected something, but I've also been surprised by finding stuff in areas I didn't expect, or finding things in areas I'd already explored previously but somehow managed to miss. So overall, I'm quite pleased with the exploration. Number 14. Good atmosphere in some new-ish environments. The starting area around Silbach wasn't doing a whole lot for me aesthetically, because despite having some really interesting structural design and mechanical engagement with the environments, the green hills and brown forests felt pretty similar to the standard types of environments around Khorinis that we'd already seen extensively throughout Gothic 2 and even Gothic 1, but I was pleased to run into what felt like some new types of environments with their own distinct atmosphere once I got a little farther outside of Silbach. That valley leading up to the woodcutter's camp and the wolf's den feels vaguely reminiscent of the Valley of Mines in Gothic 2, but for some reason felt a little bit unique to me, and the woodcutter's camp likewise adds a little bit of extra atmosphere to make it feel a little more unique than just a typical forest environment. One thing I really like about Night of the Raven is that it features several really unique environments and atmospheres that hadn't been present in the previous Gothic games, and although Archolos hasn't quite gone into any brand new territory as far as I've seen, I do appreciate some attempts to put new twists on familiar atmospheres and environments. Hopefully there will be some even more distinct environments to explore later in the game. Number 15. More mechanical benefit to underwater exploration. I was pretty shocked when I dove underwater on the starting beach and found some weeds I could actually pick up. Much like the verticality with the freeform climbing system, the new inclusion of being able to loot underwater objects adds literal depth to the world design, as you now have to think, okay, there's a lake over there, I should check underwater to see if there are any sunken treasures to find, in addition to other things like potentially finding hidden paths to new areas. It's a minor thing, but still a nice addition, especially since later Piranha Bytes games from Gothic 3 onwards completely eliminated diving underwater, thus eliminating that entire dimension from the exploration in those games. Number 16. New variations on existing enemy types. I've run into a few new enemy types in Archolos, but it's only been a few and only for a single encounter each, so I haven't yet had time to develop any serious impressions on them, but what I will say is I like how they've also added new variations of existing enemy types to add extra depth and variety to the mechanics that way. For example, I've noticed some human bandits use completely different attack animations that are much slower and more telegraphed than usual, which works well as more of a beginner fight for a low-level character, because it's a lot easier to tell when they're about to attack so you can react accordingly, as opposed to the usual attack animations which tend to happen so fast and so suddenly that you kind of just have to learn how the AI works to know when they're going to attack. So with that, human enemies now have a little more variation in their animations and thus their difficulty, which is far more preferable to simply increasing or decreasing statistical values. I also encountered a special version of a field raider for a quest which moves a lot faster than a typical raider. In particular, it circle strafes so quickly that it's really difficult to keep up with its movements, forcing you to disengage and reorient yourself more frequently so as not to get hit on your flank. That's a case where they tweaked the enemy type to make it more difficult, which again is a more actively engaging way to add variety to the difficulty of encounters. Beyond that, I also appreciate how it changes up the gameplay from enemy to enemy more, because these new types of behaviors and animations require slightly different tactics to counteract. So despite using the same old familiar combat system from Gothic 2, it has enough tricks up its sleeve to make things feel new and exciting. Number 1. Not much of a compelling story hook. This might be my biggest issue with Archolos thus far, and it's that I don't feel much of a compelling story hook early on to motivate me to keep playing. Obviously, the world design and gameplay mechanics are compelling enough on their own to make it interesting, but the story thus far hasn't caught my interest. To be fair, it takes a little while for the story to get going in these games. The first chapter of the Gothic games is pretty sparse with storytelling and main quest events, as it's primarily meant to establish the world and setting while giving you a somewhat open sandbox to explore. However, Gothic 2 at least establishes up front that dragons have invaded Khorinis and we have to stop them, go to the paladins in town and acquire the Eye of Innos. And even though you have to jump through a bunch of tedious hoops to get that first stage of the main quest completed, at least you have that framework of, I'm doing all this so I can fight the dragons. There's a clear goal you're striving towards accomplishing, both in the short term and long term, which provides motivation to get stronger and seek out more content. Gothic 1 starts you out with a somewhat uncompelling goal to deliver a letter to the magicians in the castle, but that letter does at least foreshadow the main plot about the sleeper, and then the story picks up right at the start of chapter 2 once you're sent to look into the strange ritual that the sect camp is planning. Thus far, at the start of chapter 2 in Archolos, I've yet to stumble on anything particularly compelling or interesting, and there's been no establishment of any kind of overarching plot. With Archolos, the whole premise is that you're a refugee fleeing the impending Orc War, and so you arrive on a new island with ambitions of just trying to start a new life, I guess? That's kind of a vague notion without much of a concrete goal you're striving towards, and without any sort of framework to guide your adventures or provide contextualization for what you're doing in the world. The main character's motivation is supposed to be personal concern for his brother, Yorn, since most of the main quests deal with finding stuff to treat various stages of Yorn's venomous bloodfly sting, and then eventually finding Yorn himself once he's kidnapped. But despite some attempts at establishing their backstory and relationship, I don't feel that personal connection with Yorn. In fact, there's part of me that thinks that this guy deserves all the bad stuff happening to him, because he's foolishly willing to go charging off into an unknown island by himself at night with no real survival equipment to speak of and only a vague idea of where he should be going, and then while he's still recovering from his near-fatal bloodfly sting, he asks you to beat him with a stick and then insists on getting blackout drunk. So I'm really not that interested in finding Yorn, and thus I find myself wondering, what's the point? What am I trying to accomplish on this island besides constantly trudging through busy work seeking out arbitrary MacGuffins and taking care of this imbecile named Yorn? I appreciate the characterization and backstory with Yorn and the player character, because that's kind of an interesting variation on the typical Gothic formula, but it really seems to me like I should have stumbled onto something bigger and more important by now. Like, there should be some kind of existing conflict on the island that the player gets wrapped up in while trying to go about your ordinary life, or you should be witness to some kind of bizarre supernatural event that forces you into investigating its origins due to being one of the only capable survivors to have witnessed it. I'm sure something is going to happen at some point, maybe sooner than later, but I just have a bad feeling that once I get into the city, I'm going to get sidetracked with a million side quests and new character interactions and new places to explore, and maybe several more stages of roadblocks impeding my progress towards finding Yorn, that the story is going to get set back even further. So this is one aspect where I would have liked the early stages of the main quest and storytelling to have been done a little differently. Number 2, a little too much sub-questing going on. Some of the early quests really bog down with sub-level quest objectives where a character sends you to another character to complete some task, who then requires you to do something else for them before they'll help you with their initial inquiry, which sometimes then requires you to do something else for yet someone else. When trying to secure arrangements to bury Ezekiel's daughter, for instance, you have to go to Lokvar to get his permission to bury her in the local cemetery. But to do so, you have to first pick a bunch of weeds around the cemetery and make a donation in gold for a burial plot. Then you have to convince 2 guards to go with Ezekiel to retrieve her body, and the one guard is like, yeah, I'll go, but I need someone to watch the gate while I'm gone. Go talk to Marcus. And then Marcus is like, yeah, I'll watch the gate for a while, but I'll need some ham and wine first. With Yorn, there are multiple rounds of finding a treatment for him, which involves seeking out different characters to point you towards different mages and alchemists, each of whom has you do 1 or 2 favors for them before they'll help you. I guess that's a good way to create more density of content within a smaller space, especially with some of these characters being used for multiple quests and events, but I also found it exasperating at times trying to do a seemingly simple objective and being constantly sent off on unrelated tangents. It also got to be a little tedious when you can safely guess in advance, okay, what's this person going to want me to do for them before they'll help me? Granted, this is something of an RPG trope, so it's not all that uncommon or unique to Archolos, but it's a minor annoyance that I wish could have been executed a little more smoothly. Number 3. Some annoyingly linear quest scripting. Continuing with the quest design, I've noticed a few instances where quests expect you to do things in an overly linear order to the point of just completely breaking immersion and logical flow of the gameplay. The worst offender came during the second stage of finding a treatment for Yorn when you're sent to the alchemist Bodavin. I'd already been to his cabin earlier in the game before the quest sent me there, and it was completely locked and inaccessible, which I assumed meant it would be a special location for some quest later on. Except it turns out that Bodavin doubles as an ordinary NPC merchant and skill trainer, so I'm not sure why they felt the need to restrict your access to him until that stage of the main quest. It seems like it should be perfectly reasonable to meet and interact with him as a basic service provider and then return later with a new bit of dialogue once you need another cure for Yorn. But for whatever reason, you can't even enter his hut until you're specifically sent there to find a cure for Yorn. Once you're actually allowed inside, there's an auspicious bookstand placed near his lab table, and despite being able to target the thing, you can't actually read the book, until Bodavin tells you to read the book to look up what type of bloodfly stung Yorn. That seems like a case where you should be able to freely read that book whenever you want, and if you've already read it, you can just tell Bodavin what you already know. Then some 6 scavengers spawn out of thin air right outside his hut and you're sent to fight them off, but like, why do they have to spawn after you've gotten inside already? Why can't they just already be in the environment somewhere nearby so that you have the option to deal with them first or when Bodavin asks you? That was 3 instances in a row, all in one quest, that I was pulled almost completely out of the immersion by obnoxiously restrictive linearity. I've encountered a few other similar moments too, but nothing quite as egregious as this one, fortunately. So that's something I'm hoping isn't going to be a prevalent recurring issue in later quest design. Number 4. Whole lotta hey, how's it going? A whole lot of quests and character interactions seem to be initiated by simply walking up to random strangers and asking them how they're doing or what they're up to the point that it feels like that's how the majority of the game's interactive content with NPCs is triggered. Admittedly, that's kind of how you have to break the ice when talking to people you don't know when you're new around town, but it's something of a trope in RPGs to just talk to every NPC completely unmotivated other than the extrinsic desire to seek out content. That's kind of how it is in the Gothic games too, so I can't really complain much, but it's one area where I feel like there was room for improvement that wound up being the same or maybe even worse than it was in the original games. I'm not a big fan of Skyrim, but one thing I really like about that game is it makes picking up quests feel pretty natural and organic with how often you overhear conversations or witness scenes unfolding in the environment before making a choice if you want to get involved or not, or how NPCs approach you asking for help or delivering a message from someone who's heard of your exploits, or how you approach bartenders and ask them what the local rumors are which point you towards relevant quests and NPCs. So that's the kind of stuff I would have liked to have seen more of in Archolos, instead of the usual, just talk to everyone even if you don't necessarily have a reason to approach that Archolos seems to be taking in its first chapter. Number 5. Some of the new sound effects and audio are bad. Most of the sound that I've heard in Archolos has been reused assets from the original Gothic games, but some new effects have been added for certain environments or new enemies, and they've not been consistently good. In fact, some of them have been pretty bad, enough to call attention to themselves in a negative way. The woodcutter's camp adds a new layer of ambient sound to make the woods feel more dense with constant rustling of foliage and animal noises, which are both prominently featured at the centered forefront of the sound mix with a heavy dose of reverb. It's so much that it's overbearing and feels inappropriate for such a small environment. The rustling leaves sound more like a crackling fireplace to me, which would make sense if that sound was there to represent the actual campfire that's burning, but it plays louder when you're in the trees versus when you're standing next to the fire, and those animal noises play so often that these are either the most active forest creatures in existence, or there are an impossibly vast amount of creatures in this tiny area. I like the intentions behind this new layer of ambiance, and it's part of what gives this little area its own unique atmosphere, but the execution feels wrong to me. Then there are the sounds for the new crab enemy, which sounds like someone sloshing a mixture of spit and air against their tongue, and isn't what I would personally expect a fantasy crab monster to sound like. If it were up to me, the crab would just make a bunch of clicking and clacking noises and would only make a slight vocalization when it takes damage or dies. As it is, those sounds just feel awkward and uncomfortable to me. Number 6. Too many non-interactable static objects. This is the most critical area where Archolos loses some of its Gothic feel for me, and it's that there seems to be a lot less interactivity with objects and items in the environment. So many objects in this game are based on obvious lootable inventory items, but they're treated as non-interactive decorations. It was especially bad when I broke into the trophy room of the mansion in Silbach and found numerous rare animal trophies sitting out for display, only to discover that they were there merely for the purpose of set design to establish this is a trophy room, while not serving double duty as a lootable reward for my lockpicking efforts in getting into that room. And that's simply not how a Gothic game should operate. The original Gothic games didn't go as far as to allow you to pick up every single thing you might see in an area, but you could still grab most things that seemed reasonable. If there was food or dining ware on a table, you could loot it. If there were animal skins on the floor, you could loot them. You simply can't do that in Archolos, and it's just really deflating to see all these things and not be able to do anything with them, and makes the world feel at times more like a phony stage production than an actual interactive world. Number 7. Cooking is a little tedious. Being able to cook different recipes is an obvious way to expand on the original game's mechanics with newfound depth and extra utility to existing consumable items that simply didn't exist previously, seeing as the previous Gothic games' cooking amounted to simply spamming meat on a frying pan over and over again, one at a time. It's a change that I wholeheartedly welcome, but I feel like they went a little too far with too many different recipes doing too many different things and too many different efficacy ratios with too many different ingredients and too many different states of cookedness. There's too much unnecessary complication in the system, I feel, to the point that cooking easily becomes tedious and unsatisfying for me. It's not like it's some kind of impossibly difficult task to wrap your brain around, but it's a lot of spinning wheels for something whose ultimate point is to restore health points so you can continue playing the game. Frankly, I don't find that very appealing. I don't play Gothic for cooking simulator mini-games or for open-world survival craft resource management. I play Gothic for the story, exploration, combat, difficulty progression, questing, and so on, and spending 5 or 10 minutes staring at my inventory trying to figure out what's the best thing to cook and micromanaging dozens of different resources across a dozen or more recipes, and having to go through that process every time I run low on cooked food or before setting out from town to go exploring just gets in the way of me getting to the fun parts of the game that I actually like. And it's not like you can just ignore the cooking if you don't like it either, because the benefits are so much better than eating the raw ingredients that it's simply not worth it to not use cooked recipes. The game also gives you permanent health bonuses for eating a variety of recipes, so you're further incentivized to delve into the deeper nuances of cooking up different recipes from different ingredients. It doesn't help that the interface for all this isn't very smooth either, as you have to scroll between multiple tabs to see what a recipe does and what ingredients it requires. The interface literally hides relevant information in different windows, thus adding an extra step to the process of puzzling out what recipes you're capable of cooking and which ones are the best for you to cook. Configuring the parameters for which meats or vegetables will be used for recipes that call for any type of ingredient, especially when you want to use only a specific one, is likewise a meticulous nuisance. So while I like the idea of the new cooking system, I feel like they just went overboard with it, like they could have added the extra depth and complexity to the cooking without making it so convoluted or tedious. Sometimes simplicity and streamlining can be a good thing, and while I'm not advocating for the extreme simplicity of Gothic 1 and 2's cooking, this is a case where a little more streamlining compared to what they did with Archolos might have been to the game's benefit. Number 8. Bad sorting of items in inventory. Piggybacking off the last point, the game does a non-existent job of sorting items in your inventory. If you use the Gothic 1 inventory system, it at least sorts items into relevant tabs, like putting all your weapons in one tab, your food items in another, and so on, thus saving you the hassle of having to scroll up and down through one giant window like in Gothic 2. But it doesn't group similar types of items together properly within those subcategories. In the food tab, for instance, you end up with cooked recipes spread out in all kinds of different random places, while all the different types of meats likewise get spread out in random places, when it seems like you should have all your cooked recipes together at the top of the window, followed by all your cooked meats, then the uncooked meats, then the vegetables, and so on. The same goes for the miscellaneous tab, with different animal skins or keys spread apart for no apparent reason. So when I'm fumbling around with my inventory trying to figure out if I have enough resources to craft a particular item or cook a particular recipe, I'm having to search all over the place just to find what I need, which is further complicated by so many items using similar looking models and icons, making it so you have to select each one manually to tell which specific type of meat it is. With how many items you typically accrue over the course of these games, I'm worried this is going to become a huge hassle later in the game. Number 9. Spontaneously spawning enemies. The Gothic games have always used respawning enemies at designated points in the story, usually after advancing to a new chapter or when a new quest requires their presence, but they usually did a better job of spawning the new enemies somewhere off-screen so that you weren't witnessing them materialize out of thin air, which happens a lot in Archolos. The aforementioned quest with Bodavin and the 6 scavengers has them literally spawning out of nowhere within plain sight of the camera, and there are numerous occasions when seemingly random spawns, presumably done for the sake of making the world feel more dynamic and alive, have creatures popping into existence right before your eyes. There's even a quest to rid one of the fields in Silbach from a disturbing beast, but you can be standing in the proper field with no creature in sight, then read the notice, and then it'll suddenly be there right in front of you when you put the notice away. It's not a huge deal, all things considered, but it's one of those little blemishes that does take away from the immersion whenever it occurs, and is something I wish could have been handled a little better. Number 1. I can't tell if the voice acting is good, bad, or mediocre. I don't speak Polish, so I can't say with any sort of confidence or accuracy how I feel about the Polish dub. To my completely ignorant ears, it sounds like some of the actors are doing a decent job of trying to inject engaging emotion into their deliveries, like for example when Ezekiel is mourning the death of his daughter.
Moneta do pieprzonej monety. Pilnowałem ich jak oka w głowie, bojąc się, że je stracę i mój interes upadnie. Tak bardzo byłem w nie zapatrzony, że wszystko inne przestało mieć dla mnie jakiekolwiek znaczenie. Zadbałem o bezpieczeństwo monet, a nie potrafiłem ochronić mojej własnej córki.
And the crazy warehouse guard in Silbach likewise sounds appropriately crazy for the personality he seems to be evoking in the written dialogue.
Zaraz go dostanie to, na co zasługuje. Pójdzie do jego chaty i włoży gnój do łóżka.
But then there are some actors who sound like they're trying to do a bad character accent, like the one guy doing a bad old man voice.
Pomożesz no staremu? Rypie mnie w kościach, a i oczy już nie te.
Again, I can't say for certain because I don't know Polish, but I will say that, generally speaking, it seems alright to me, and generally preferable to having no voice acting at all, though I would of course prefer to be playing with a well-executed English dub, or maybe even a German dub, which I might stand at least some chance of understanding. Number 2. Some odd translation hiccups. For being a game created in Polish, the English translation is surprisingly good most of the time and feels completely natural, except for when it doesn't. Which is rare, but there are still moments when a word or phrase doesn't get translated quite right and it pulls me out of the experience just a little bit. For example, there's the Mace of Condominium, which is a type of apartment complex where people own their units instead of renting them, or the early insistence to find a cure for Yorn's bloodfly sting by seeking out a barber, which is someone who cuts and styles your hair. I've also heard the repeated use of the phrase, "don't drink it all," when someone hands me gold as a reward, which I think is supposed to mean, don't spend it all on booze, but that's not any kind of common English phrase I've ever heard of. The equivalent phrase I'm familiar with would be, don't spend it all at once. Then there's a repeated use of the word tracts to describe areas of land between Silbach and the city, which is technically an accurate use of the term per dictionary definitions, but I never hear anyone use that word in that context in casual conversation, the one exception being a joke in Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
She's beautiful, she's rich, she's got huge tracts of land.
There are other moments too, but again, these are all minor. For the most part, the translations seem spot on and it feels natural and sensible to understand what people are talking about. After all, I've played games with much worse translations, so the efforts here are certainly welcome. Number 3. A more direct approach to the storytelling. As I alluded during the lack of compelling story hook section under things I dislike, Archolos takes a more direct approach to its storytelling up front with a more carefully crafted survival scenario that gets you from the ship onto the shore and finally into Silbach, with a whole lot of scripted cutscenes and character interactions between you, Kurt, and Yorn that are meant to shape Marvin's relationship with his relatives. That's a bit of a different style than the Gothic games take, which is usually more hands-off in the first chapter with letting you freely explore the world at your own pace and stumble upon world-building details on your own. So that's interesting, and it works as a nice twist on the typical Gothic formula, but I'm not sure how I feel about it. On the one hand, I'm not usually fond of heavy-handed storytelling in these kinds of games, and there are times when Archolos starts riding that line. But on the other hand, I do like a good story, and dislike it when a Gothic game has no story. I'm just not sure the actual story in Archolos has actually started yet, so I'm not sure what to make of it thus far. Number 4. The soundtrack is a mix of good and questionable. The soundtrack has a lot of nostalgic flair to it by virtue of quoting so many memorable melodies and parts from Kai Rosenkranz's iconic work with the early Gothic games, and it's fun to hear some of these familiar motifs being used in a new arrangement with new backing parts. Some of those combinations work better than others, however, and some of the tracks seem to be inappropriately mashing familiar parts together that don't really go together in my opinion, making them feel somewhat out of place. There's also a moment of extreme dynamic contrast and tonal shifting during one of the tracks that feels reminiscent of Gothic 3's soundtrack and how it had a tendency to jump out of the screen at you with over-the-top compositions that would break the immersion. The track in question sounds pretty calm and tranquil and feels like a good match for casual exploration, but then it has a rapid crescendo that made me think combat music was starting up the first time I heard it and made me pause what I was doing to look around for some kind of enemy that had snuck up on me. Every time that phrase plays, it doesn't feel like it matches anything that's happening on screen and just feels jarring to me. Still, the new compositions are generally pretty good. I really like that one harp track that plays in Silbach, which somehow manages to feel nostalgic despite being all new original music, and I appreciate that they used a lot of live musicians to record so many of the new parts. Number 5. Variable lockpick combinations. The Gothic games had a common exploit with locked doors and chests, where they all had fixed combinations that you could deduce through trial and error and then reload your save once you figured out the full combination to crack the lock without breaking any lockpicks. Whether you consider that to be a good or bad thing, the designers of Archolos apparently decided to remove the exploit by making locks have variable combinations that change each time you load your save. That's a change I can get behind, because it was admittedly too easy to pick a difficult lock when you could save scum your way through it, but I still find myself save scumming in Archolos to get through locks more efficiently. If, say, I wind up breaking 4 lockpicks on a 6 combination lock, then I'll try again until I randomly get through it while only breaking 2 or 3 lockpicks instead. So in the end, it's not really eliminating the save scumming from the gameplay, it's just putting an actual premium on lockpicks once again by making your limited supply more likely to dwindle over time. So I'm not sure the variable combinations is really the best solution to the so-called problem, but I think it's a step in the right direction at least. Number 6. Learning magic circles and runes seems unreliable. It seems like the process of learning magic on Archolos is pretty different from how it used to be. Instead of approaching a skill trainer and paying them to teach you magic circles and then buying runes from a merchant or making them yourself with a crafting system, it seems like you have to learn magic circles by randomly finding books in the environment and spending skill points to read them, and you likewise acquire magic spells by randomly finding spell runes in the environment. That doesn't seem very desirable to me, because that seems like it would make the whole magic system come down to random, arbitrary luck as to what you find, when, and where. Granted, part of being a melee fighter or ranged fighter is randomly finding better equipment through exploration, so tying magic progression to exploration in a similar way makes some sense, but at least with bows and swords, they're all functionally identical, just with different stat requirements and damage values. You get stronger when you find new gear, but your core gameplay systems aren't fundamentally altered with each new one you find. It's not like spells where they have completely different functions, with some being utility spells like healing or casting a light source, or others that freeze opponents in place or put them to sleep, or deal projectile damage or deal damage in an area effect, and so on. If there's no consistently reliable way to learn magic circles or acquire spell runes, then I worry it could get frustrating trying to find the type of thing you need through blind luck. I'm not sure I want to play a magic character in general, especially knowing that you can't officially join a mage faction in the game, but the whole presentation of the magic system thus far has me really skeptical of whether it would actually be fun or not. Number 7. Early concepts of fate versus free will. I think I've noticed at least 3 separate occasions in Chapter 1 where the dialogue system gives you a choice, as Marvin, to profess your belief that everything we do is fated to happen for a reason, or to say that you control your own destiny. That's an interesting concept, especially because it stands in stark contrast to Gothic 1 and 2, which kind of forced a divine will upon you by explicitly making the nameless hero a chosen avatar of the gods. Whether you personally believed in all of that stuff or not, and even despite Nameless's quippy protests, it was pretty clear that divine influence is real and that it was playing some kind of influence in your adventures. So it's interesting to see Archolos apparently subvert that by leaving the question open-ended and giving you the opportunity to roleplay your own perspective on it. They seem to be deliberately making that a recurring theme in Chapter 1, so I'm wondering if that's going to play into the story later on. It's still super early, so I can't say for sure, but it's something I noticed and want to keep an eye out for as I continue playing. And that about wraps up my preliminary thoughts on the Chronicles of Myrtana Archolos after finishing the first chapter. As I mentioned already in the introduction, it's been a lot of fun thus far, and I'm overall very impressed with the quality work that's gone into its design, production, and execution. The single best thing you can say about it is how genuine it feels to the Gothic experience, which is a breath of fresh air in a time when few other games can scratch that itch. It's a true nostalgia treat for Gothic fans, but at the same time it's not relying purely on nostalgia to sell itself, as it has a lot of new and exciting content to offer alongside some quality improvements to the core gameplay formula with newfound refinements and extra depth added to existing systems. I'm very much looking forward to finishing it and giving it a proper review treatment, or at least releasing an updated final thoughts video, but it may be a while before I can get to that, so stay tuned and be on the lookout for some kind of future Chronicles of Myrtana content. I'll also plan to start uploading my playthrough once I get a little further, so there's that to look forward to as well. In the meantime, I'm eager to hear your thoughts on Archolos. What do you like or dislike about it, and in what ways do you consider it to be better or worse than the original games? Just please, as a reminder, keep spoilers to a minimum so that myself and others can engage in the discourse while still having a fresh game experience along the way.